In the frozen countryside of rural Vermont, where winter storms bury secrets as deep as snow, a giant white stallion staggers toward an abandoned barn, starving and near death. Inside, Eleanor Hartwell, a 72-year-old war widow, discovers the magnificent creature and makes a choice that will change everything she thought she knew about loss, memory, and the world beyond what we can see. What begins as simple compassion becomes something far stranger when the horse's eyes reflect understanding no animal should possess, when lights dance in the forest at midnight, and when Eleanor's dreams fill with battlefields she never witnessed, and a voice calling her name. But here's what haunts her most. The stallion bears a mark identical to her husband's final letter, written 40 years ago from a place that shouldn't exist. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth across Eleanor Hartwell's property, a smell that had become as familiar to her as her own breath over the past 40 years. She stood at the kitchen window of her farmhouse, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that Thomas had bought at a county fair in 1979. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she held it anyway, watching the sky darken with the promise of snow. The farm stretched out before her in shades of gray and white, 90 acres of rolling Vermont hillside, bordered by dense forest. On 3 sides and a gravel road that saw maybe 2 cars a day on the 4th. The barn stood 200 yards from the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, its roof sagging in the middle like an old horse's back. Thomas's grandfather had built it in 1923, and Thomas himself had reinforced the beams the summer before he left for his final deployment. Eleanor was 72 years old, though most days she felt both older and younger than that number suggested. Her hair, once the color of chestnuts, had gone silver years ago. She kept it short now, practical, no longer bothering with the elaborate style she'd worn when Thomas was alive. Her hands were strong from work, weathered from wind and soil, capable hands that had delivered calves, mended fences, and signed the papers that made her a widow in 1985. The house was quiet in the way only a house occupied by one person can be. Not silent, but filled with the particular sounds of solitude, the creak of old floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway that had belonged to Thomas's mother. Eleanor had learned to find comfort in these sounds, or perhaps she'd simply grown accustomed to them. There was a difference between the two, though she couldn't always remember which was which. She'd lived alone here since Thomas died. Their daughter, Caroline, had moved to Seattle in 1989, married a software engineer, and now had 3 grown children of her own. They spoke on the phone every Sunday, and Caroline visited twice a year, always trying to convince Eleanor to move to a retirement community, always leaving disappointed when Eleanor politely declined. This land was hers, Thomas's, their life. Together lived on in every fence post and garden bed, and she would not abandon it for the convenience of assisted living and scheduled activities. The storm was coming. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, the way her grandmother used to predict weather by the ache in her knees. The National Weather Service had issued warnings for the next 3 days. Heavy snow, high winds, possible power outages. She'd already brought in extra firewood, filled the bathtub with water in case the well pump died, and checked the generator Thomas had installed back in 1982. She was prepared, as she always was. Preparation was survival in these mountains, especially in winter, especially alone. Her daily routine had become a kind of meditation over the years. Wake at 6, coffee and toast, listen to the local news on the radio. Morning chores, check the fence lines, feed the chickens, tend the winter garden in the greenhouse Thomas had built. Lunch at noon, always simple. Afternoons varied. Reading, correspondence, small repairs around the property, dinner at 6, usually soup or stew, something that could last several days. Evenings were for memory and television, though mostly memory. She thought about Thomas every day, but not in the sharp, cutting way she had in the years immediately after his death. Now the memories were softer, worn smooth like river stones, the way he'd whistle while fixing machinery, always the same tune he'd learned in basic training. The laugh lines around his eyes, his hands, larger than hers, calloused and gentle. The last morning she'd seen him, standing in this very kitchen, coffee cup in hand, telling her he'd be home in 6 weeks. He'd kissed her forehead, shouldered his duffel, and walked out into an April dawn. She never saw him alive again. The official explanation had been vague, classified. Training accident, they said. Helicopter crash in a region they wouldn't name, doing work they couldn't discuss. Thomas's body had been returned in a sealed casket with instructions not to open it. She'd received his personal effects in a cardboard box, dog tags, wallet, wedding ring, and a single letter in a waterproof envelope. The letter had been strange, filled with phrases that made no sense. She'd read it 100 times in the first year, searching for meaning, finding only confusion and grief. Eventually, she'd locked it away with his other things, trying to let go of questions that had no answers. But grief, Eleanor had learned, never truly releases its grip. It simply changes shape, becomes part of the architecture of who you are. The town of Ironwood lay 8 miles down the mountain, a collection of buildings that had seen better days and better economies. Once a thriving logging community, it had dwindled to a population of just under 300 souls who stayed because they'd been born there or because they had nowhere else to go. Eleanor drove down once a week for supplies, exchanging pleasantries with the same faces she'd known for decades, never lingering longer than necessary. Dr. Samuel Reeves had his veterinary practice on the edge of town, a small clinic attached to his house, where he'd lived since his wife Martha passed 5 years ago. Sam was 68, a tall man gone slightly stooped with age, with kind eyes and hands that had set more broken bones than he could count. He and Eleanor had developed an easy friendship over the years, bonded by the common language of loss and the practical needs of rural life. He'd tended her chickens through disease, helped her put down an old dog that had grown too sick to continue, and sometimes stopped by for coffee without any professional reason at all. Betty Chen ran the post office, a position she'd held for 30 years after moving to Ironwood from San Francisco in search of a quieter life. At 55, she was the town's unofficial newskeeper, knowing everyone's business through the mail she sorted and the conversations she overheard. Betty had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, but her heart was generous. She'd been the first person to bring Eleanor a casserole after Thomas died, and she'd continued checking in ever since, never making a fuss about it, just being present in the small ways that mattered. The storm arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, 3 weeks before the winter solstice. Eleanor had spent the morning in the greenhouse, checking on her winter vegetables, talking to them the way she'd done for years. Thomas used to tease her about it, but she'd read somewhere that plants responded to human voices, and besides, it gave her something to say out loud. The tomatoes were doing well, the lettuce was crisp, and the herbs filled the space with their green fragrance. She was carrying a basket of fresh lettuce back to the house when she noticed the sky. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a grey ocean wave, moving faster than seemed natural. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the past hour. The chickens had already gone silent, huddled in their coop. Even the crows had disappeared from their usual perches in the oak tree. Eleanor quickened her pace, old instincts kicking in. She secured the greenhouse door, checked the barn, made sure everything that could blow away was tied down or brought inside. By 4 o'clock, the first snowflakes were falling, fat and lazy. By 5, the wind had picked up, turning the snow horizontal. By 6, visibility had dropped to nothing, and the world beyond her windows had become a wall of white. She ate dinner, listening to the storm rage against the house, the wind howling like something alive and angry. The lights flickered twice, but held. She'd lived through dozens of storms like this, maybe hundreds. Vermont winters were not kind to the weak or the unprepared. She was neither. At 9 o'clock, she checked the thermometer mounted outside the kitchen window. -5 degrees and dropping. The wind chill would make it far worse. Nothing should be out in this weather. Nothing would survive. She was about to turn away when she saw it. A shape, massive and pale, moving through the storm. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the snow and darkness. But then she saw it again, closer now, staggering through the drifts toward the barn. An animal, large, struggling through the blizzard with the desperate determination of something that knew it was dying. Eleanor grabbed her heavy coat from the hook by the door, pulled on her boots, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The wind tried to push her back, but she leaned into it, using her walking stick for balance, following the shape she'd seen. The barn door was open, swinging on its hinges. She'd closed it. She always closed it. But now it hung wide, and just inside the threshold, collapsed in the straw and snow, lay the most magnificent horse Eleanor had ever seen. A stallion, pure white, enormous. His sides heaved with labored breathing, ribs visible beneath a coat matted with ice and mud. His eyes, when they found hers, were dark and intelligent, and filled with something that looked terribly like understanding. Eleanor knelt beside the stallion, her knees protesting against the cold barn floor. Up close, the horse was even larger than she'd thought, easily 17 hands tall, maybe more. His breathing was shallow and rapid, each exhale creating small clouds in the frigid air. She'd grown up around horses, had owned 3 over the years, but she'd never seen one quite like this. His build suggested a draft breed, perhaps Percheron, but his features were more refined, almost aristocratic. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling for injuries. The horse was severely underweight, his coat dull and patchy where it wasn't matted with ice. No visible wounds, but hypothermia and starvation were enemies enough. His hooves were cracked and overgrown, suggesting months of neglect. Someone had abandoned this magnificent creature, left him to die alone in the wilderness. The stallion's eyes followed her movements. Most horses in his condition would be too far gone to care about human presence, but this one watched her with an awareness that made her uncomfortable. She'd seen that kind of intelligence before, in working dogs and wild animals, but never in a horse. It was as if he was assessing her, deciding whether to trust her. Eleanor made her decision. She couldn't leave him here to freeze. Even if he died anyway, at least he wouldn't die alone in the cold. She stood, her back aching, and moved to the barn's storage area. Thomas had kept it well stocked with veterinary supplies, and she'd maintained the inventory over the years. She found blankets, clean straw, a first aid kit, and what remained of the feed she kept for occasional visitors. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until morning when she could call Sam. The work took 2 hours. She spread fresh straw around the stallion, creating a dry bed. She covered him with 3 heavy blankets, tucking them carefully around his massive frame. She melted snow in a bucket over a camping stove, bringing the water to room temperature before offering it to him. He drank slowly at first, then more eagerly. Good, that was good. Thirst meant he still wanted to live. She mixed a small amount of grain with warm water, creating a mash that would be easier to digest than dry feed. The stallion ate, his movements weak but deliberate. Eleanor sat beside him, one hand resting on his shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing begin to stabilize. The barn creaked and groaned under the storm's assault. Wind found every gap in the walls, creating strange whistling sounds that rose and fell like voices. The single lantern she'd lit cast dancing shadows across the stalls and rafters. Outside, the world had disappeared into darkness and snow. Eleanor's gaze fell on the stallion's left shoulder, where the hair grew in a slightly different direction, creating a pattern in his coat. She leaned closer, holding the lantern up. 3 circles, interlocking, forming a symbol she'd seen before but couldn't quite place. She traced it with her finger, and the horse's skin twitched beneath her touch. Then it came to her. The memory arrived with such sudden clarity that she gasped. Thomas's letter. The final one, the strange one she'd locked away years ago. There had been a drawing in the margin. 3 interlocking circles, with a single word beside it in Thomas's handwriting. What was it? She closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember Guardian. He'd written Guardian next to the symbol, along with other words that had made no sense. White Guardian. The crossing. When the snow comes. She'd thought it was the rambling of a man under extreme stress, maybe injured, maybe worse. The military had explained nothing, and she'd eventually stopped trying to understand. But here it was, the same symbol, marked naturally in this horse's coat, 40 years after Thomas had drawn it in a letter from halfway around the world. Eleanor's hand trembled as she pulled it away from the stallion. Coincidence, it had to be coincidence. Life was full of patterns that meant nothing, symbols that appeared by chance. She was an old woman, alone in a storm, tired and emotional, seeing connections that didn't exist. The horse's eyes found hers again, and this time she could have sworn she saw something in them, recognition, or maybe reassurance, as if the animal understood her fear and was trying to tell her something. She settled back against a hay bale, pulling her coat tighter. She would stay with him through the night. Whatever this was, wherever he'd come from, he deserved that much. Come morning, she'd call Sam, get proper help, and let rational thought return. But for now, in this moment suspended between storm and stillness, Eleanor Hartwell kept vigil beside a dying horse that carried her dead husband's symbol on its shoulder. Dawn arrived grey and silent. The storm had passed sometime in the early hours, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached halfway up the barn walls, and the trees bowed under the weight of ice. Eleanor woke stiff and cold, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before memory returned. The stallion. She sat up quickly, joints protesting. The horse was still breathing, still alive. More than that, he seemed improved. His eyes were clearer, his breathing steadier. He'd managed to stand at some point during the night, had drunk more water, eaten more of the mash she'd prepared. Against all odds, he was fighting his way back from the edge. Eleanor pushed herself up, using the hay bale for support. She was too old to be sleeping on barn floors. Her back would remind her of this foolishness for days. But as she looked at the stallion, at the way morning light caught the white of his coat and turned it almost luminous, she felt no regret. She trudged back to the house through knee-deep snow, each step an effort. The cold had settled into her bones, and all she wanted was hot coffee and a warm bath. But first, she needed to call Sam. This horse needed proper veterinary care, needed someone who understood medicine and healing better than an old widow with good intentions. The phone line was down. She'd expected as much. The storm had probably taken out power lines all down the mountain. Her generator was running, keeping her own lights on, but communication with the outside world would have to wait until the county crews cleared the roads and repaired the damage. She made coffee, scrambled eggs, and ate standing at the kitchen counter. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from Sam's place down in the valley. He'd check on her eventually once the roads were passable. Until then, she was on her own. After breakfast, Eleanor went to her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Beneath folded sweaters and Thomas's old flannel shirts that she couldn't bring herself to donate, she found the wooden box. Cherry wood, handmade, with brass hinges that had tarnished over time. Thomas had crafted it himself during a long winter, back when their marriage was young and full of plans. Inside were the relics of his life. Dog tags on their chain. His wedding ring, which she'd never been able to wear after he died, the weight of it too heavy with meaning. A handful of photographs, Thomas in uniform, Thomas with his unit, Thomas holding newborn Caroline. His wallet, still containing his driver's license, with a younger face staring out from behind cracked plastic. And the letter. The envelope was military issue, addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. No return address. The postmark was dated March 15th, 1985. He died March 18th, 3 days between writing and death. 3 days when he'd known something was wrong, had tried to tell her something important. She carried the box back to the kitchen table and opened the letter with hands that had steadied over 40 years of rereading. The paper was thin, slightly yellowed, covered in Thomas's distinctive handwriting. Most of it was typical. I love you. Tell Caroline I'll be home soon. Take care of the farm. But the final paragraph had always troubled her. If something happens to me, remember that I made a choice. Not everyone would understand it, but it was the right one. There are things in this world, Ellie, that exist outside what we think we know. I've seen them. The White Guardian showed me. When the snow comes and the crossing opens, you'll understand. 3 circles. The symbol of the bridge between. I don't regret it. I only regret leaving you. But maybe I won't be as gone as they'll tell you I am. Below the words, he'd drawn the symbol. 3 interlocking circles, each one perfectly round, connected at their edges to form a pattern that was both simple and somehow profound. She'd shown it to military investigators, to therapists, to anyone who might explain what Thomas had meant. They'd all given her the same sympathetic looks, stress, trauma, the confused writings of a man facing death. But Eleanor had never quite believed that. Thomas had been many things, pragmatic, steady, grounded, but never confused. If he'd written these words, he'd meant them. She just hadn't been able to understand. Until last night, until a white horse, marked with the same symbol, collapsed outside her barn in a snowstorm. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Then she pulled on her boots and coat and headed back to the barn. The stallion was standing now, still weak, but gaining strength with each hour. When she entered, his ears pricked forward, and he made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a whinny, something softer, more personal. She approached slowly, offering her hand. He lowered his head and pressed his muzzle against her palm. His breath was warm, his eyes impossibly knowing. "Who are you?" Eleanor whispered. "And what did my husband have to do with you?" The horse had no answers. But standing there in the quiet barn, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in 40 years. Purpose, and perhaps impossibly, hope. The stallion's recovery defied everything Eleanor knew about horses and survival. By the second day, he was eating regularly, moving around the barn with increasing confidence. By the third, he seemed almost healthy, as if the creature who'd collapsed near death had been replaced by something vital and strong. Eleanor had seen animals bounce back before, had witnessed the resilience of livestock that refused to die. But nothing like this. This was impossible. She spent those days in the barn watching him, caring for him, trying to understand. The roads remained impassable, the phone lines still down. The storm had isolated her completely, leaving her alone with her thoughts and this mysterious horse that should not be alive. On the 4th morning, Eleanor made a decision. She needed to see the symbol more clearly, needed to confirm what she'd seen that first night. In daylight, with steady hands and clear eyes, she would examine the marking on his shoulder and compare it directly to Thomas's drawing. The stallion stood calmly as she approached, as if he'd been expecting this. She ran her hand along his neck, speaking softly, then moved to his left shoulder. The hair grew in distinct patterns there, creating the 3 interlocking circles she'd noticed before. But now, in full light, she could see additional details. Within each circle were smaller marks, almost like symbols within symbols. The pattern was too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidence. Eleanor returned to the house and retrieved Thomas's letter, carrying it carefully back to the barn. She held the paper up beside the horse's shoulder, comparing the drawing to the living mark. They matched, not approximately, not close enough. Exactly. Every curve, every intersection, every small detail Thomas had sketched 40 years ago existed in this animal's coat. Her hands began to shake. She stepped back, the letter falling from her fingers to the straw-covered floor. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her grounded through decades of solitary life, was screaming that this was impossible. Coincidences happened, patterns repeated in nature. and grief could make people see connections that didn't exist. But Eleanor had not survived 72 years by ignoring what her senses told her. And her senses were telling her that something profound and inexplicable had entered her life. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around her. Thomas's words echoed in her mind. "The White Guardian showed me. When the snow comes and the crossing opens, you'll understand." What crossing? What had he meant? At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went to the window. The night was clear, the storm's aftermath leaving the sky sharp with stars. And there, at the edge of the forest, she saw them. Lights, not flashlights or headlights or any kind of illumination she recognized. These were different. They moved like living things, dancing between the trees, shifting colors from blue to green to silver. They pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. Eleanor watched, transfixed. The lights appeared for perhaps 5 minutes, then faded as if they'd never existed. She stood at the window for another hour, but they didn't return. The next morning, she mentioned nothing to herself about what she'd seen. Speaking it aloud would make it real, would force her to confront possibilities she wasn't ready to accept. Instead, she focused on practical matters. The county had finally cleared the main road. Phone service had been restored. She could call Sam now, could get professional help for the stallion. But when she lifted the receiver, she found herself hesitating. What would she tell him? That she'd found a horse that should be dead but was thriving? That it bore a symbol from her dead husband's letter? That she was seeing lights in the forest? Sam was a good man, a friend, but he was also practical and scientific. He would have explanations for everything, rational explanations that would make sense and strip away the mystery. Eleanor hung up the phone. Not yet. She needed to understand more first. She spent the afternoon in the barn, simply sitting with the stallion, watching him, trying to make sense of what was happening. The horse seemed content with her presence, occasionally moving close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. There was a peace in the barn that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being part of something larger than her solitary existence. As evening approached, she began talking to him. At first, just simple things. About the weather, about the farm, about the chickens that had started laying again. But gradually her words turned more personal. She told him about Thomas, about the 40 years of missing him, about the questions that had never been answered. The stallion listened, his dark eyes fixed on her face. And Eleanor could have sworn, though she knew it was impossible, that he understood every word. That night Eleanor's dreams changed. They had always been vivid, populated by memories and the faces of people long gone, but these were different. These felt real in a way that transcended ordinary dreaming. She stood in a desert landscape she'd never seen before. Mountains rose in the distance, jagged and brown against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was hot and dry, filled with dust that coated her throat. She could feel the sun burning her shoulders, could smell something acrid like smoke or chemicals. And there was Thomas, not as she'd last seen him, 40 years older in her memory, but young. 35, maybe 36. He wore desert camouflage, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He was running, and behind him 4 other soldiers ran as well. They were shouting, but Eleanor couldn't make out the words. The dream had sound, but it was muffled, as if she were underwater. Then she saw what they were running from. The ground was opening, not like an earthquake, but deliberately, surgically, as if invisible hands were pulling reality apart at the seams. Through the gap, light poured out, the same blue-green-silver light she'd seen in her forest. And through that light, shapes moved, horses, white horses, dozens of them emerging from somewhere that wasn't the desert, wasn't anywhere on Earth. Thomas stopped running. His team kept going, but he stopped and turned back toward the light. One of the horses approached him, larger than the others, marked on its shoulder with 3 interlocking circles. Thomas raised his hand, palm out, and the horse pressed its muzzle against his skin. The scene shifted. Now Thomas was writing, hunched over paper in a tent, his hands shaking. He was writing the letter, the one Eleanor held. She could see the words forming on the page, could watch him draw the symbol with careful precision. His lips moved, and this time she could hear him, clear as if he were standing beside her. "Ellie, if you're seeing this, if you're dreaming this, then it found you. I made a promise. I gave something of myself to save my team, and in return, I was given a promise. When the time comes, when the crossing opens again, the Guardian will come for you. Don't be afraid. I'm not as gone as they told you. I'm in the between. I'm in the waiting. And when the snow comes, when the circles align, we'll have a chance. One chance. Trust the White One. Trust what you feel. I love you. I've always loved you. I'm still loving you." Eleanor woke, gasping, tears streaming down her face. The bedroom was dark, the clock reading 3:15. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands clutched the blankets with desperate strength. It had been a dream. Just a dream. Except it hadn't felt like a dream. It had felt like a memory, like something Thomas had placed inside her mind, waiting for the right moment to surface. She threw off the covers and went to the window. The lights were back, brighter now, closer to the house. They moved through the trees with purpose, as if searching for something, or guarding something. Eleanor pulled on her robe and boots and went outside. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. She walked toward the lights, toward the forest edge, compelled by something she couldn't name. Behind her, from the barn, she heard movement. The stallion. He was awake. She could feel it, could sense his awareness even across the distance. The lights stopped moving when she reached the tree line. They hovered there, perhaps 20 feet away, pulsing gently. Up close they were even stranger. Not solid, not gas, something in between. They cast no shadows, made no sound, but they radiated a feeling. Welcome, recognition, home. Eleanor stood in the snow in the middle of the night, staring at impossible lights while a mysterious horse watched from her barn. And for the first time since Thomas died, she felt the edges of her carefully constructed world beginning to crack open, revealing something vast and strange and terrifying beneath. She whispered into the darkness, "I don't understand any of this." The lights pulsed once, bright and clear, as if in answer. Then they faded, leaving her alone in the night with questions that multiplied like stars. Morning came with the sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road. Eleanor was already awake, had been awake since the lights disappeared, sitting at her kitchen table with cold coffee and Thomas's letter spread before her. She recognized the sound of Sam's truck before she saw it, the old Ford diesel that had been making that same grinding noise for 3 years. She met him at the door. Sam climbed out slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air, carrying his veterinary bag and a thermos of what was probably tea. He'd been a tea drinker since Martha died, said coffee reminded him too much of their morning routine. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with concern, "I tried calling yesterday, but your line was busy. Wanted to make sure you weathered the storm all right." "I'm fine, Sam, but I'm glad you're here. I have something I need you to look at." They walked to the barn together, their boots crunching through snow that had started to develop an icy crust. Sam talked about the storm damage in town, the power lines that were still down on the east side, the Henderson's roof that had partially collapsed. Eleanor listened but didn't really hear. Her mind was too full of lights and dreams and impossible connections. When she opened the barn door, Sam stopped mid-sentence. The stallion stood in the center of the space, magnificent in the morning light that streamed through the high windows. His white coat seemed to glow, and his presence filled the barn with an almost physical weight. "Good Lord," Sam breathed. "Where did he come from?" "He showed up during the storm. Collapsed right outside. I've been nursing him for almost a week now." Sam approached slowly, his professional eye taking in every detail. He walked around the horse, noting his size, his condition, the unusual refinement of his features. The stallion stood calmly, allowing the examination with the patience of something that had been through this before. "Eleanor, this horse should be dead. He's malnourished, his hooves are in terrible shape, and he's been exposed to severe cold. But his vitals... Sam pressed his stethoscope against the stallion's chest, listened, frowned, listened again. His heart rate is perfect. Lungs clear, temperature normal. It's like he was never sick at all. I know, Eleanor said quietly. Sam continued his examination, checking teeth, eyes, legs, hooves. He worked in silence, and Eleanor could see him struggling with what his instruments were telling him. Finally, he stepped back and looked at her directly. This isn't natural, Eleanor. I've been a veterinarian for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this. A recovery this fast, this complete. It doesn't happen. It can't happen. But it did happen. Yes. He packed his instruments away slowly. It did. Which means either my understanding of veterinary medicine is fundamentally flawed, or there's something about this horse that defies normal explanation. Eleanor took a breath. Sam, can I show you something? She led him to where the stallion stood and pointed to the marking on his shoulder. Sam leaned close, studying the pattern. His fingers traced the circles, and she saw his expression shift from curiosity to confusion. That's not a brand, he said. It's natural hair growth. But the pattern is too precise, too deliberate. He pulled out his phone and took several photos. I want to research this, see if there's a genetic explanation for markings this exact. Eleanor retrieved Thomas's letter from her coat pocket and handed it to him. Before you do, read this. Sam unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes moving over Thomas's words. She watched his face as he read, saw the moment he reached the final paragraph and the drawing. He looked from the letter to the horse, then back again. Eleanor, this is... I know what it is, Sam. I know how it sounds. But that's my husband's handwriting from 40 years ago, and that's the exact same symbol on this horse's shoulder. Not similar. Exact. Sam was quiet for a long moment. There has to be a rational explanation. Does there? Because I've been looking for one for a week and I can't find it. I've seen things, Sam, lights in the forest. Had dreams that feel more real than waking. This horse understands me. I know that sounds insane, but he does. He responds to things no animal should understand. Eleanor. Sam's voice was gentle but firm. You've been alone up here for a long time. Grief can do strange things to perception, maybe. Maybe I'm a lonely old woman seeing patterns that don't exist. She didn't mean for her voice to sound sharp, but it did. I thought the same thing, but then I keep seeing more evidence, more connections, and now you're standing here telling me this horse's recovery is medically impossible. The stallion moved between them, as if sensing the tension. He pressed, his muzzle against Eleanor's shoulder, and she felt that same wash of calm she'd experienced before. Sam watched this interaction, and she could see him reconsidering his words. I'm not saying you're wrong, Sam said carefully. I'm saying I don't know what to make of this, and that troubles me because I'm a man who likes answers. He folded the letter and handed it back to her. What do you want to do? I want to understand what Thomas was trying to tell me, what he knew, what this horse has to do with him. Sam nodded slowly. Then we need more information. Thomas's military records, maybe, or someone who served with him. The records are classified. I tried getting them unsealed years ago. The government wouldn't budge. What about his unit? Any of them still alive? Eleanor shook her head. They all died in the same incident. Helicopter crash, they said. Thomas was the only one whose body they recovered. The stallion moved away from them, walking to the far end of the barn where a window looked out over the forest. He stood there, perfectly still, staring at the tree line. Both Eleanor and Sam turned to look, but saw nothing unusual, just snow and pines and winter light. He does that, Eleanor said, watches the forest like he's waiting for something. Sam was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. I've been noticing strange things around here for the past few weeks. Animal behaviors that don't make sense. Deer moving in groups when they should be solitary. Birds migrating at the wrong time. My neighbor's dog won't stop howling at night, and she's the calmest animal I've ever treated. You think it's connected? I think something is happening in this region that we don't understand. And your horse showing up in the middle of it, that can't be coincidence. He pulled a leather-bound notebook from his bag. I keep a field journal, have for 30 years. Observations, unusual cases, patterns I notice. Let me show you something. He flipped through pages covered in neat handwriting and sketches. 3 weeks ago, I treated a fox with a broken leg. While I was examining her, she kept looking at the sky. Not random glances, focused attention on a specific point. I looked up but saw nothing. 2 weeks ago, old Tom Chen's cattle refused to graze on the north pasture. No reason for it. Grass was fine, no predators, nothing spooked them. But they wouldn't set foot past a certain line. He turned another page. Last week, during the storm, I watched a murder of crows fly straight into the wind. Against every instinct, they were heading toward your property. Eleanor felt cold that had nothing to do with the barn's temperature. You think they were coming here? To the horse? I think something drew them. Same thing that might have drawn him. Sam closed the journal. Martha used to say I was too rational for my own good. That I missed things because I only believed what I could measure. After she died, I started paying attention differently, noticing the spaces between the facts. And Eleanor, there are a lot of spaces around this situation. They spent the next hour going through everything Eleanor had experienced. The lights in the forest, the dreams, the way the stallion seemed to understand her. Sam listened without judgment, taking notes, asking questions. It felt good to speak it all aloud, to have someone else bear witness to the strangeness. I want to come back tonight, Sam said finally. Watch for these lights you've seen. If they're real, if I can observe them too, then we know you're not imagining things. And if you don't see them, then we consider other explanations. But Eleanor, I've known you for 20 years. You're one of the most level-headed people I've ever met. If you say you're seeing something, I believe you're seeing something. I just want to understand what. After Sam left, Eleanor spent the afternoon with the stallion. She'd started thinking of him as the guardian, capital G, though she felt foolish doing it. But the name fit. He had a quality of watchfulness about him, of protection, as if his presence created a safe space within the barn. She began teaching him simple commands, more out of habit than necessity. Horse training had always soothed her, the patient work of building trust and communication. But the guardian learned with impossible speed. 1 repetition and he understood, 2 and he anticipated. By evening, he was responding to gestures she hadn't even made yet, reading her intentions before she fully formed them. You're not a normal horse, she told him, but I suppose you know that already. The guardian turned his head to look at her, and in his dark eyes she saw something that might have been amusement, or agreement, or both. As sunset approached, Eleanor returned to the house to prepare dinner. She made extra, enough for 2, knowing Sam would arrive soon after dark. Through the kitchen window she could see the barn, solid and familiar against the darkening sky. The guardian stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the interior light, watching the forest. Always watching, and in the trees beyond, as night settled over the mountain, the first faint glimmers of light began to appear. Sam arrived at 8 o'clock, carrying a thermos of tea and a pair of binoculars. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, eating stew and bread, talking about everything except the reason he was there. Old friends comfortable with silence, they watched darkness settle completely over the land. At 9:30, Eleanor saw the first light. Just a flicker at the forest edge, blue-green there and gone. She touched Sam's arm and pointed. He lifted the binoculars, adjusting the focus. I see it, he said quietly. More lights appeared. They emerged from between the trees, moving with fluid grace, pulsing gently. Sam watched through the binoculars, while Eleanor observed with bare eyes. The lights were brighter tonight, more numerous, at least a dozen of them, dancing and weaving through the darkness. They're not reflecting off anything, Sam said. Not refracting. The light doesn't behave like any spectrum I recognize. He lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. "Eleanor, this is real. Whatever this is, we're both seeing it." They watched for 20 minutes. The lights moved closer, reaching the edge of Eleanor's property, stopping at an invisible boundary. The Guardian was in the barn. Eleanor could feel his awareness, his attention focused on the same phenomenon they were witnessing. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights began to fade, not going back into the forest, but disappearing like mist in sunlight. Within moments, the night was ordinary again, lit only by stars and the thin crescent of a winter moon. Sam set down his binoculars carefully. "I need to tell you something. Martha saw lights like that the night before she died." Eleanor turned to him. "Sam, she called me into the bedroom around midnight, said there were beautiful lights outside, wanted me to see them. I looked but saw nothing. Told her it was probably the medication, that she should rest. She died the next morning." His voice was steady, but Eleanor heard the weight behind it. "I've wondered ever since if I missed something important. If there was something real that I dismissed because it didn't fit my understanding of the world. You couldn't have known." "No, but I can know now. I can pay attention now." He looked at her directly. "I believe you, Eleanor. I don't understand what's happening, but I believe it's happening, and I want to help you figure it out." They sat in silence for a while, drinking tea that had gone lukewarm. Finally, Sam spoke again. "You should talk to Betty Chen tomorrow if the roads are clear. She's been postmaster here for 30 years. If there's local history or folklore about this kind of thing, she'll know. Or she'll know who to ask." Eleanor nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." After Sam left, Eleanor checked on the Guardian one final time before bed. He was lying down in the fresh straw, but his eyes were open, alert. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his neck. "What are you?" she whispered. "What did Thomas do? And why did you come to me now, after all these years?" The Guardian exhaled slowly, his warm breath creating clouds in the cold air. Eleanor felt something pass between them, not words exactly, but a sense of meaning, patience, timing, purpose. Things were unfolding as they needed to, in the order they needed to unfold. She stayed there for an hour, just being present before returning to the house. That night she dreamed again, but this time the dream was different, gentler. She saw Thomas not in danger but at peace, standing in a place that was neither here nor there, a space between spaces. He was waiting, and he was not alone. Other figures stood with him, shadowy and indistinct, but present, and among them white horses, many white horses. The Guardians, she understood somehow. They were all Guardians. Thomas looked at her across the distance, and she felt his love as strongly as if he were standing beside her. He pointed to something she couldn't quite see, something in the space between them. A bridge, perhaps, or a door, or a crossing. She woke with the word crossing echoing in her mind. Thomas had written it in his letter, "When the crossing opens." What was a crossing? A place, a time, an event? Eleanor rose and went to her desk, pulling out a notepad. She began writing down everything she knew, creating a timeline, looking for patterns. Thomas's death in March 1985, the symbol on the Guardian, the lights in the forest, the dreams, Sam's observations of animal behavior, Martha seeing lights before she died. She worked until dawn, covering pages with notes and questions. By the time sun broke over the mountains, she had the beginning of a theory, not a complete understanding but a direction, and she knew her next step. She needed to go into town, needed to talk to Betty, needed to start digging into the history of this place and what it might have to do with white horses and lights and crossings between worlds. The drive into Ironwood took 40 minutes on roads still slick with ice. Eleanor drove carefully, her old truck handling the curves with the familiarity of thousands of previous journeys. The Guardian had watched her leave from the barn door, and she'd felt an odd reluctance to go, as if something important might happen in her absence. But she needed answers, and answers required leaving the safety of her property. The town looked tired in the grey morning light. Main Street was lined with buildings that had stood since the logging boom of the 1920s, most now housing struggling businesses or standing empty. The post office occupied a brick building on the corner, its flag snapping in the wind. Betty Chen was sorting mail when Eleanor entered. She looked up and smiled, her face crinkling with genuine warmth. Betty was 55, compact and efficient, with grey streaking through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Eleanor!" Twice in 1 month. "Are you feeling all right?" "I need to ask you something, Betty, about local history." Betty set down her stack of letters. "This sounds serious." "Come on back." They settled in Betty's small office behind the counter, surrounded by sorting bins and postal regulations. Eleanor pulled out her notepad, feeling suddenly foolish. But she'd come this far. "Have you ever heard stories about white horses appearing in this area? Maybe before significant events or during unusual circumstances?" Betty's expression shifted from curious to thoughtful. "White horses. That's specific. Where's this coming from?" Eleanor hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "I found a horse on my property during the storm. White stallion, no identification, no owner claiming him. And I've been having strange dreams, seeing unusual things. It made me wonder if there's local folklore I don't know about." Betty leaned back in her chair. "You're not the first person to ask about white horses. My grandmother used to tell stories. Said her grandmother had seen one back in 1889, right before the big fire that burned half the valley. And there were whispers during the war years, people seeing white horses near the old Abenaki sites." "What kind of whispers?" "The kind people don't talk about openly. You know how it is in small towns. Strange things get noticed but not discussed. Folks see something unusual, they mention it to their neighbors quietly, but nobody wants to be the crazy one talking about impossible things." Betty stood and went to a filing cabinet. "But I keep records. I'm a postmaster. Records are what I do." She pulled out a worn folder, flipped through pages until she found what she wanted. "Here, newspaper clipping from 1967. Local boy Billy Henderson swore he saw a white horse in the forest the night before his brother came home from Vietnam. Brother had been listed as missing in action for 8 months. No explanation for how he survived, how he made it back. Just showed up at the Canadian border with no memory of the time between." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Do you have more? A few?" "Scattered over the decades. Always the same pattern. White horse appears. Something impossible happens, horse disappears. Most people dismiss it as coincidence or myth. But Eleanor, I've lived here my whole life, except for 10 years in San Francisco. I've learned that myths usually have roots in something real." "What about the Abenaki?" "You mentioned their sites. Now that's interesting territory. The Abenaki have been in this region for thousands of years. They have stories about spirit animals, about thin places where the world of the living touches other worlds. Robert Callahan would know more. He's Abenaki, lives up on the North Ridge. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's a historian of sorts. Studies the old ways." Eleanor wrote down the name. "How do I find him?" "I can call him for you. Robert and I go way back. He helped my family when we first moved here, taught my father about the land." Betty picked up her phone. "Let me see if he's willing to meet with you." The conversation was brief. Betty explained the situation in broad terms, listened, nodded, then hung up. "He'll see you. Says to come this afternoon. He's intrigued by your white horse." She wrote down directions. "Eleanor, be careful up there. Robert's a good man, but he takes these things seriously. If he thinks something sacred is involved, he'll want to know everything. I'll tell him the truth about what you've seen, or the truth about what you think is happening." Eleanor folded the directions carefully. "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." She spent the rest of the morning at the library, a small building that smelled of old paper and heating oil. The librarian, a woman in her 30s whom Eleanor didn't know well, helped her access the historical archives. Eleanor searched through decades of local newspapers, looking for any mention of white horses, unexplained phenomena, strange lights. She found 3 articles, one from 1945, describing lights in the forest after a soldier's return from Europe, one from 1967, Betty's article about Billy Henderson, and one from 1985 dated March 20th, 2 days after Thomas died. The headline read, "Mysterious lights reported near Green Mountain Forest." Local residents puzzled. Robert Callahan's cabin sat at the end of a narrow road that wound through dense pine forest. Eleanor almost missed the turnoff, marked only by a small wooden sign carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The cabin itself was modest but beautifully maintained, built from logs that had weathered to a rich gray. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a collection of wind chimes hung from the porch, creating a gentle music in the breeze. Robert emerged before she'd fully parked. He was 82, Betty had said, but he moved with the easy grace of someone much younger. His face was deeply lined, his long grey hair pulled back in a braid, and his eyes held the kind of clarity that came from spending a lifetime paying attention to things most people missed. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, not a question. Betty called ahead. "Come inside. It's too cold for old bones to stand around talking." The cabin's interior was warm and smelled of sage and wood smoke. Books lined every wall, stacked on tables, piled in corners. Eleanor saw volumes on history, anthropology, astronomy, and languages she couldn't identify. In one corner stood a desk covered with maps, some contemporary, others that looked hand-drawn and ancient. Robert gestured to a chair near the fire and poured tea from a pot that had been steeping. "Betty said you have a white horse, one that appeared during the storm. Yes, he should have died. Instead, he's thriving, and he has a mark." Eleanor pulled out her phone, showed him the photos she'd taken of the guardian's shoulder. 3 interlocking circles. "My husband drew this same symbol in a letter 40 years ago, right before he died." Robert studied the photos carefully, then set the phone down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your husband, Thomas Hartwell. He died in 1985, military service, classified mission." "How did you know that?" "Because I remember the lights that appeared the night he died. I was 52 years old, standing in my backyard, watching the forest glow like it was on fire, but with cold light. I knew something significant had happened, something that touched the old places." He sipped his tea. "The Abenaki have stories that go back further than any written history in this region. Stories about Wabanaki, the dawn horse, a spirit guide that appears at crossings." Betty mentioned crossings. "What does that mean?" Robert stood and moved to his desk, returning with a hand-drawn map. "The world is not as solid as most people think. There are places, thin places, where the boundary between this reality and others becomes permeable. The Abenaki called them crossings. Most of the time they're dormant, stable. But under certain conditions, celestial alignments, specific times of year, strong emotional resonance, they can open." He pointed to the map. Eleanor recognized the outline of the Green Mountains, the valley where Ironwood sat. But Robert had marked dozens of points with the same 3-circle symbol. "These are crossing sites that have been documented over centuries. Your property, Eleanor, sits directly on one of the most powerful." Eleanor felt cold despite the fire's warmth. "Thomas was stationed near crossing sites?" "In Afghanistan, yes. The Abenaki aren't the only people with these stories. Similar legends exist worldwide. Different names, different traditions, but the same essential truth. And white horses, they appear in many of these traditions as guardians or guides. Beings that can move between worlds, that carry messages or souls from one side to another. You're saying Thomas encountered one of these crossings, and it killed him? I'm saying he encountered something profound and made a choice. The letter you described, the one where he drew the symbol, that sounds like a man trying to explain the unexplainable." Robert refilled their tea. "There's a story my grandfather told me. During the 1800s, a warrior from our people went on a vision quest near what's now your property. He was gone for 3 days. When he returned, he was changed. Spoke of meeting the dawn horse, of being shown the space between life and death, of learning that some souls don't cross fully. They wait in the between, held by love or duty or unfinished purpose." "Thomas is waiting," Eleanor said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "He's been waiting for 40 years, and now the dawn horse has come to you. That's not random, Eleanor. That's intentional. The guardians don't appear without reason." Robert leaned forward. "Tell me everything." The dreams, the lights, how the horse behaves. All of it. Eleanor talked for 2 hours. Robert listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a leather journal. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "The winter solstice is in 19 days, he said finally. "The longest night of the year, when the boundary between worlds is thinnest. If a crossing is going to open fully, that's when it will happen. And Eleanor, if Thomas has been waiting, if he's bound to the space between, the solstice would be his chance. Maybe his only chance. His chance for what? To cross over completely. To find peace, or," Robert met her eyes, "to come back." Eleanor drove home as dusk settled over the mountains, her mind churning with everything Robert had told her. Come back. The possibility hung in the air like smoke, tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure. She'd spent 40 years learning to live with Thomas's absence, building a life around the empty space he'd left. What would it mean if that space could be filled again? The Guardian was waiting when she returned. He stood outside the barn, his white coat luminous in the fading light, and when she approached, he walked directly to her and pressed his forehead against her chest. The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You know, don't you?" she whispered. "You know what's coming." That night, her dreams intensified. She saw Thomas more clearly than ever, standing in that strange between space. He was surrounded by others now, dozens of people, all waiting. Some had been there for years, others for decades. She understood somehow that these were the ones who'd made choices at crossings, who'd given something of themselves to save others or protect something sacred. They existed in a state of suspension, neither fully alive nor fully dead, held by bonds they'd forged in moments of extreme choice. Thomas reached toward her, and she felt the distance between them like a physical ache. So close, just on the other side of a barrier she couldn't see but could feel. He mouthed words she couldn't hear, but she understood them anyway. Soon. Wait. Trust. She woke to find herself standing in her nightgown at the barn door, her bare feet numb with cold. She had no memory of leaving the house, of walking through the snow. The Guardian stood beside her, as if he'd been watching over her while she sleepwalked. Eleanor looked at him, at the barn, at the forest beyond where faint lights were already beginning to gather. "This is really happening," she said aloud. "This is real." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension of time. Eleanor felt caught between ordinary life and something vast and inexplicable. She went through her daily routines, feeding chickens, maintaining the property, but everything felt distant, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. Sam visited every few days, bringing supplies and conversation. He'd started his own research, reading everything he could find about paranormal phenomena, dimensional theory, quantum physics. He showed up one afternoon with a stack of books and articles, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement Eleanor remembered from her own youth when discovery felt possible. "There's scientific precedent for this," he said, spreading papers across her kitchen table. "Well, theoretical precedent. Physicists talk about multiple dimensions, parallel realities, places where the normal rules of space and time break down. What if the crossings Robert described are real physical phenomena? What if there are points where these realities intersect?" Eleanor appreciated his enthusiasm, but she was past needing scientific validation. She knew what she was experiencing. The question wasn't whether it was real. The question was what to do about it. Betty stopped by with a box of old newspapers she'd found in the post office archives. More articles, more scattered references to white horses and unexplained events. One caught Eleanor's attention. A piece from 1932, describing a woman who'd lost her husband in a mining accident. She'd reported seeing a white horse on their property for weeks afterward and claimed her husband visited her in dreams, telling her things no one else could have known. The town had dismissed her as grief-stricken and possibly insane. She died 6 months later, alone and isolated. "That could be me," Eleanor said quietly. "If I tell people what's happening, they'll think I've lost my mind. But you haven't," Betty said firmly. "You're the sanest person I know, and you're not alone. You have Sam, you have Robert, you have me. We're all seeing this with you. Margaret Whitmore, the librarian, called one evening. She was 79, had lived in Ironwood her entire life. "Betty told me you're researching the white horse stories. I wanted you to know I saw one. 1968, the night before my brother came home from Vietnam. We'd been told he was missing, presumed dead. I was sitting on my porch, and this horse just appeared at the edge of the woods. Beautiful white stallion watching me. I felt something shift inside, like hope being returned. Next morning, the telegram came. My brother was alive on his way home. Did the horse stay? No, once I knew my brother was safe, it disappeared. Just faded away like morning mist." Margaret's voice was soft with memory. "I never told anyone except my husband. People don't understand these things. They want everything to fit into boxes, to have logical explanations. But some things exist outside logic." Eleanor thanked her and hung up. She stood at her window, watching the guardian in the pasture. She'd let him out during the day now, and he stayed close to the barn, never wandering far. He was waiting too, she realized, waiting for the same thing Thomas was waiting for. The solstice, the crossing, the moment when barriers dissolved and choices became possible. 10 days before the solstice, something changed. Eleanor woke to find the guardian agitated, pacing the barn, his ears flat against his head. She'd never seen him like this. Since his arrival, he'd been calm, almost supernaturally peaceful. But now tension radiated from him like heat. She approached carefully. "What's wrong?" The guardian moved to the barn door, looking out toward the road. Eleanor followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual. Just the long driveway, the trees, the morning light. But the horse remained focused, alert, his whole body communicating warning. An hour later, she understood. A black SUV turned onto her property, moving slowly up the drive. Eleanor didn't recognize the vehicle. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones almost unheard of. She walked out to meet it, the guardian watching from the barn. 2 men emerged. Both wore expensive outdoor clothing that looked new and out of place. The older one was perhaps 70, trim and military in bearing despite civilian clothes. The younger might have been 45, with cold eyes and a way of standing that suggested training in violence. "Mrs. Hartwell?" the older man said. "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, retired. This is my associate, Mr. Chen. We're sorry to intrude, but we're looking for a horse. White stallion, quite large. He went missing from a research facility several weeks ago, and we've tracked him to this area." Eleanor kept her face neutral. "I haven't seen any horse matching that description." Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's interesting, because several people in town mentioned you'd been asking questions about white horses, and a veterinarian named Samuel Reeves told someone he'd examined an unusual white stallion at your property." She felt a flash of anger at Sam, immediately followed by understanding. Sam hadn't told anyone. Someone had been asking questions, investigating, and people had talked without realizing the implications. "I found an injured horse during the storm," Eleanor said carefully. "I helped it and it left. If you're looking for a lost animal, you might try the county animal control." "Mrs. Hartwell, I don't think you understand the situation. This horse is valuable, more valuable than you can imagine. He's part of a long-term research project that has significant national security implications." Webb took a step closer. "We're prepared to compensate you generously for his return. And we're also prepared to pursue other options if necessary." "That sounds like a threat." "It's a reality. This is not a domestic animal, Mrs. Hartwell. This is government property. Keeping him would be theft." Eleanor felt the guardian's presence behind her, knew he'd moved to the barn entrance despite the danger. Webb's eyes shifted, saw the horse, and something in his expression changed. Not relief, hunger. "There he is," Webb said softly. "After all these years, after all the searching." "You've been looking for him for years?" Eleanor asked. "I thought you said he went missing weeks ago." Webb realized his mistake. His smile disappeared. "I think we should continue this conversation inside, Mrs. Hartwell. There are things you need to understand about that animal." "No. I think you need to leave my property." Chen moved then, his hand going to his jacket. Eleanor saw the outline of a weapon and felt fear spike through her. But before anything could happen, Sam's truck came roaring up the driveway, followed by another vehicle she recognized as Robert's old Jeep. Sam jumped out, placing himself between Eleanor and the two men. "Is there a problem here?" "Dr. Reeves," Webb said. "How convenient. You can explain to Mrs. Hartwell the importance of cooperating with federal authorities." "I can explain that you're on private property making threats," Sam replied, "and that unless you have a warrant, you need to leave." Robert emerged from his Jeep more slowly. He was old, but there was something in his bearing that made both Webb and Chen reassess. He looked at Webb with recognition that Eleanor didn't understand. "Marcus Webb," Robert said quietly. "I wondered if you'd show up. It's been a long time since Afghanistan." Webb's face went pale. "Callahan, you're still alive." "Some of us are. Some of us made it back whole, not like Thomas Hartwell." Robert turned to Eleanor. "This man was in your husband's unit. He was there when Thomas made his choice at the crossing, and he's been trying to find the Guardians ever since, trying to control what he doesn't understand." "Thomas saved their lives," Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her. "And you've been hunting what he protected." Webb's expression hardened. "Thomas made a deal with something dangerous, something that shouldn't exist, and that horse is the key to understanding it, to controlling it, to using it." He looked at the Guardian. "Do you have any idea what we could accomplish with access to those crossings, the strategic advantages, the possibilities?" "That's not what they're for," Robert said, "and you know it. The Guardians don't serve, they witness, they guide, they protect the balance between worlds." "Mystical nonsense," Webb spat. "That horse is a tool, a biological mechanism for accessing dimensional rifts, and I will have him." The standoff lasted nearly a minute, silence heavy with tension. Finally, Webb stepped back, his hand raised in a gesture of peace that fooled no one. "We'll be back with proper authorization," he said, "and Mrs. Hartwell, I'd advise you to consider your position carefully. Interfering with a federal investigation carries serious consequences." They left, but Eleanor knew this wasn't over. She watched the SUV disappear down her driveway, feeling the world she'd briefly opened closing around her like a trap. "How did you know to come?" she asked Sam and Robert once the vehicle was out of sight. "Betty," Sam said. "She saw them asking questions at the post office this morning, recognized Webb from old newspaper photos. She called me, I called Robert, and we came as fast as we could." Robert was looking at the Guardian, who had remained perfectly still throughout the confrontation. He knew they were coming. That's why he was agitated. The Guardians can sense intention, especially hostile intention. "Eleanor, you're in danger now. Webb has been obsessed with the crossings for 40 years. He was the only survivor from Thomas's unit who came back unchanged, and he's spent every year since trying to access what Thomas found." "Why? What does he want?" "Power. Control, the ability to move between dimensions, to access information from alternate timelines, to see possible futures. He thinks the Guardians are the key, and in a way he's right. They are conduits, but they're not tools to be used. They're sacred beings, and trying to force them leads to catastrophe." Eleanor felt exhausted suddenly, the weight of everything pressing down on her. "I don't know what to do. I can't fight the federal government. I can't protect the Guardian from whatever resources Webb can bring to bear." "You're not alone in this," Sam said firmly. "We're with you, all of us." "Sam's right," Robert added, "and there's something else you should know. The Abenaki community has been watching your property since the Guardian arrived. We've known something significant was happening. If Webb comes back, he won't find just an old woman and a horse. He'll find people who have protected these sites for centuries and aren't about to stop now." That evening, Robert returned with 3 others from the Abenaki community. Margaret Whitmore came, bringing her nephew, who was a lawyer. Betty arrived with her husband and 2 thermoses of coffee. By nightfall, Eleanor's kitchen was filled with people, all committed to helping her protect the Guardian and see this through to the solstice. They made plans. Margaret's nephew would file injunctions, create legal barriers to any attempt at seizure. The Abenaki would maintain watch on the property, rotating shifts. Sam would document everything medically and scientifically, creating records that might offer protection. Betty would monitor communications, watch for any signs of Webb's return. Eleanor listened to them organize, feeling overwhelmed by their support. She'd lived alone for so long, had grown accustomed to solving problems by herself. But this was beyond her capacity to handle alone, and these people were offering not just help, but belief. They believed her. They believed in what was happening. After everyone left, Eleanor went to the barn. The Guardian was calm again, the earlier agitation gone. She sat beside him in the straw, her hand resting on his neck. "Thomas encountered Webb in Afghanistan," she said quietly. "Webb was there when you appeared, or when one of your kind appeared, and Thomas made a choice that saved his unit, but trapped himself. Webb has been trying to exploit that ever since." The Guardian turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. In their depths, Eleanor saw confirmation, saw memory, saw pain that wasn't quite human, but was no less real. "The solstice is in 9 days," she continued. "Whatever is going to happen, it's going to happen then, and Webb knows it. He'll come back. He'll try to take you or control the crossing or both." She felt the Guardian's response, not in words but in emotion. Determination, protection, purpose. He would not be taken. He would fulfill what he'd come to do. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her cheeks. "Thomas has been waiting for 40 years. I've been grieving for 40 years, and now there's a chance for something, reunion or closure or understanding, and this man wants to turn it into a weapon. I won't let that happen. I don't care what it costs me." The Guardian pressed closer to her, his warmth surrounding her. Outside, the forest lights appeared, brighter than ever before. They moved through the trees like a procession, like witnesses gathering for something momentous. Eleanor watched them through the barn door, understanding that she was part of something ancient and ongoing. A story that had been unfolding for centuries and was now reaching a crucial chapter. She thought about Thomas in his between space, about all the others waiting there, about the Guardians who moved between worlds, carrying messages and souls and hope. She thought about Webb and his hunger for control, his inability to see the sacred in what he sought to exploit. And she made her own choice, as Thomas had made his. She would protect the Guardian. She would see this through to the solstice. She would face whatever came with the people who stood beside her and trust that love was stronger than fear, that sacred things remained sacred no matter how much force was brought against them. 9 days until the crossing opened. 9 days to prepare for whatever that would mean. 5 days before the solstice, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed watching shadows move across her ceiling, her mind too full of questions and possibilities to rest. At 3 in the morning, she gave up and went downstairs, intending to make tea and sit with her thoughts. That's when she noticed it. Thomas's dog tags, hanging on their chain from a hook by the door where she'd placed them decades ago, were glowing. Not brightly, not enough to light the room, but with a soft, unmistakable luminescence. She approached slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for them. They were warm. After 40 years of hanging cold and lifeless, they radiated heat like they'd just been taken from a living body. Eleanor lifted the chain, feeling the weight of the metal tags, and saw something that made her breath catch. New symbols had appeared on the surface, etched into metal that had been blank and regulation standard. The 3 interlocking circles, yes, but also others she didn't recognize, writing in a language that looked ancient and alien and somehow familiar all at once. She carried them to the kitchen table, turned on every light, and examined them closely. The symbols seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them, as if they existed partially in another dimension. Her rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that metal didn't spontaneously develop new engravings. But that voice was growing quieter with each impossible thing that happened. Eleanor grabbed her coat and went to the barn. The guardian was awake, as if he'd been expecting her. She held up the dog tags, and the horse's reaction was immediate. He stepped forward, pressed his muzzle against the metal, and exhaled slowly. The tags glowed brighter in response. "What does this mean?" Eleanor whispered. The guardian moved to the far corner of the barn, to a section Eleanor had cleaned but never paid much attention to. He pawed at the ground, insistent, repeating the motion until she understood. He wanted her to dig. She found a shovel and began removing the packed dirt. 6 inches down, her blade struck something solid, metal. She cleared away more soil and uncovered a military-grade storage case, the kind designed to survive decades of burial. Thomas's name was stenciled on the lid in faded white paint. Her hands shook as she pried it open. Inside, protected by waterproof sealing, were items Thomas had hidden before his final deployment. Photographs. She pulled them out one by one, her vision blurring with tears. Thomas in Afghanistan, standing beside a white horse. Not just any white horse. The guardian, this guardian. Younger perhaps or ageless, but unmistakably the same animal. There were more photos. Thomas's unit. 5 men, all grinning at the camera despite the desert dust and visible exhaustion. Thomas, with his hand on the guardian's neck, his expression peaceful in a way Eleanor had rarely seen during his military years. And one photo that made her gasp. Thomas standing at what looked like a tear, in reality itself, a visible rift in the air, with the guardian beside him and light pouring through from somewhere else. Beneath the photos were documents. Mission reports, heavily redacted but still revealing. Project Guardian, the headers read, Investigation of Dimensional Anomalies in Afghanistan Region. References to ancient sites, to local legends about white horses and thin places. Notes in Thomas's handwriting describing encounters with beings that existed between states of matter and consciousness. And then she found the audio cassette tape. It was labeled in Thomas's careful script for Eleanor, when the white one comes. Eleanor's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold it. She returned to the house, found the old cassette player she kept in a box of obsolete electronics, and with shaking fingers pressed play. Thomas's voice filled her kitchen. Not the formal, measured tone of his letters, but his real voice, intimate and close, speaking to her across 40 years of silence. Ellie, if you're hearing this, the Guardian found you. I knew he would. I asked him to, made it part of our agreement. I need to explain what happened, what I did, and why. You deserve to understand. A pause, the sound of Thomas taking a breath, gathering himself. Our unit was sent to investigate reports of anomalies near an ancient site. We thought it was going to be routine, maybe smugglers or insurgents using caves. But what we found was something else entirely. A crossing, Ellie, a place where the walls between worlds had worn thin. And it was active. We stumbled into something that had been there for thousands of years, something the locals had built shrines around and told stories about. Another pause. Eleanor could hear wind in the background, the distant sound of military equipment. The crossing was destabilizing. Our presence, our technology, something we did triggered a cascade. It was going to tear open completely, and not in a controlled way. People could have died. My team, civilians in nearby villages. The Guardian appeared. He showed me what needed to be done. Someone had to anchor the crossing from both sides, to hold it stable while it settled. Someone had to stand in the between and accept being split across dimensions. Thomas's voice continued, steady despite the magnitude of what he was describing. I volunteered. My team tried to stop me, but I was the ranking officer, and it was my call. The Guardian walked me through it. He's not just an animal, Ellie. He's ancient, conscious, part of something bigger than we can fully understand. He showed me how to bind myself to the crossing, how to use my own life force to stabilize the dimensional barrier. The process would leave me split. Part of me would die, would return home in that casket they sent you. But part of me would remain in the between space, anchoring the crossing until it fully healed. Eleanor heard him swallow hard, heard the emotion breaking through his controlled tone. I made the Guardian promise me something in return. When the crossing healed, when enough time had passed, he would find you. He would come to you during a convergence, when the barriers thin naturally. He would give us a chance, Ellie, one chance. Either I cross over completely and find peace, or we have a moment together before I go. A real goodbye. The one we never got. The tape hissed with static. Eleanor realized she was crying, tears falling onto the kitchen table. I know this sounds impossible. I know you've spent 40 years thinking I'm dead, and in most ways I am. But the part of me that loved you, that loves you still, that part has been waiting. Not in pain, not suffering. Just waiting in a place between heartbeats, between breaths, between one world and the next. The Guardian has carried me there. He's kept his promise. Another long pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was softer, more intimate. Webb was there. He saw everything. He tried to stop me, wanted to claim the crossing for military use. The Guardian had to block him physically, had to prevent him from interfering. Webb went back and reported that we'd been attacked, that I'd died in the incident. He's been searching for the Guardians ever since, trying to access the crossings for himself. He doesn't understand that they can't be forced, can't be controlled. The crossings respond to sacrifice, to love, to willing choice. Webb's hunger for power makes him incapable of the connection he seeks. The sound of helicopters grew louder on the tape, voices shouting in the background. I have to go, Ellie. They're evacuating us. This tape will go into the case I'm burying at the barn, the place where we first talked about building our life together. The Guardian knows where it is. He'll lead you to it when the time comes. I love you. I've loved you since the moment we met, and I'll love you from wherever I am until we see each other again. Don't be afraid of what's coming. Trust the Guardian. Trust what you feel. And know that every choice I made because I'd rather exist in pieces, knowing you're safe, than be whole in a world where you were hurt. The tape clicked off. Eleanor sat in the silence that followed, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. He'd been waiting. For 40 years, some essential part of her husband had existed in a space between worlds, held there by the choice he'd made and the promise the Guardian had given. She looked at the dog tags in her hand, at the symbols that had appeared. They were changing again, she realized, growing brighter, more defined. The Guardian was doing this, or the crossing was, or Thomas himself from wherever he waited. The tags were becoming a key, a bridge, a focal point for what would happen at the solstice. Eleanor returned to the barn as dawn broke. The Guardian stood in the center, the morning light making his white coat luminous. She approached and carefully placed the dog tags around his neck. The chain settled against his chest, and the symbols flared once, bright enough that Eleanor had to look away. When her vision cleared, she saw the Guardian had changed. Not physically, but in presence. He seemed larger, more solid, more real. And in his eyes, she saw something that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Not the animal intelligence she'd observed, but human awareness. Thomas's awareness. You're both, aren't you? She whispered. You're the Guardian, but you also carry Thomas inside you. You've been carrying him all this time. The Guardian, Thomas, the being that was somehow both, lowered his head in acknowledgement. And Eleanor understood the full truth of what was coming. The solstice wouldn't just open a crossing. It would force a choice. Thomas could cross over completely, leaving this world and finding peace. Or he could return, somehow, impossibly, through the bond he'd forged with the Guardian 40 years ago. But only if Eleanor was willing to accept the cost. Only if she could face Webb's interference and whatever other forces the convergence would unleash. She had 5 days to decide what she wanted. 5 days to prepare for the moment when the impossible became real, and every choice mattered more than she could imagine. Eleanor called Sam immediately after dawn. Her voice was steady, but he must have heard something in it because he arrived within the hour, Robert following 20 minutes behind. She played them Thomas's tape, showed them the photographs, explained what she now understood about the Guardian carrying Thomas's consciousness. Sam listened in silence, his scientific mind visibly struggling with information that defied every principle he'd built his life around. But when the tape ended, he simply nodded. "What do you need from me? I need to know what's medically possible. If Thomas crosses back, if he somehow returns through the Guardian, what happens to his body, to his consciousness? Can a human being exist after being split across dimensions for 40 years? I don't know, Sam admitted. This is so far beyond conventional medicine. But I'll research everything I can find about consciousness, about near-death experiences, about people who've been in comas for decades and recovered. Maybe there are parallels, patterns that might help." Robert was studying the photographs with intense focus. "These symbols on the dog tags, they're not Abenaki, but they're similar to markings I've seen in very old sites. Pre-contact, maybe pre-human. The crossings have been here longer than any of us, longer than any civilization we know about." He looked up at Eleanor. "The solstice is in 5 days. The convergence will be powerful. But Eleanor, you need to understand what you're facing. Webb will come back. He knows the timing as well as we do. He's been waiting for this as long as Thomas has, just for different reasons. Then we prepare," Eleanor said. "We make this property defensible. We protect the Guardian until the convergence happens." Over the next 3 days, Eleanor's isolated farm transformed into something resembling a command center. The Abenaki community arrived in shifts, bringing traditional protective items and knowledge passed down through generations. Robert drew symbols around the property boundary, markers that he said would alert them to intrusions. Margaret's nephew filed multiple legal actions, creating bureaucratic barriers that would slow any official attempt to seize the Guardian. Betty organized a communication network, connecting everyone with walkie-talkies and establishing check-in schedules. Her husband, a retired state trooper, advised on security measures. They installed motion sensors along the driveway, set up observation posts with clear views of all approaches. Sam brought medical equipment, setting up a small field hospital in Eleanor's guest room. If Thomas does cross back, if there's a physical manifestation, he might need immediate care. "I want to be ready." Eleanor spent hours with the Guardian, feeling the dual nature of his presence growing stronger. Sometimes he was purely hoarse, responding to her touch with animal warmth. Other times, she felt Thomas looking out through those dark eyes, felt her husband's consciousness pressing close to the surface. She talked to him, to both of them, sharing 40 years of life he'd missed. Caroline's wedding, the grandchildren's births, the small triumphs and quiet griefs that made up a life. The Guardian listened with an attention that was achingly familiar, and Eleanor felt something she hadn't allowed herself in decades. Hope. But fear came with it. What if the convergence failed? What if Webb interfered and destroyed their chance? What if Thomas had been waiting for 40 years, only to be denied at the final moment? On the 4th day before solstice, Eleanor woke from a dream so vivid it felt like memory. She was standing at the crossing, could see the shimmer in the air where dimensions met. Thomas stood on the other side, close enough to touch, but separated by a barrier thin as gossamer and strong as steel. He was speaking, but she couldn't hear the words. She pressed her hand against the barrier, and he mirrored the gesture from his side. The warmth of his palm almost reached her. Almost, but not quite. She woke with tears on her face and Thomas's name on her lips. The Guardian was outside her window, watching the house. She understood he'd been there all night, standing vigil while she dreamed. Eleanor rose and dressed, her body moving with purpose. She made coffee, ate breakfast mechanically, then went to her closet and pulled out a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the clothes she'd worn the day she married Thomas. Not the wedding dress, which had long since been donated, but the simple blue dress she'd worn to the courthouse when they'd eloped, too in love to wait for a formal ceremony. It still fit, mostly. She was thinner now, older, but the dress slipped over her head and settled around her like a memory. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing the girl she'd been layered beneath the woman she'd become. "If he comes back," she said to her reflection, "I want him to see me in something that matters. Something from when we began." She spent that day putting her affairs in order. She wrote letters to Caroline, explaining everything, knowing her daughter would think she'd lost her mind, but wanting the truth documented anyway. She updated her will, made arrangements with Margaret's nephew for the property's future. If something went wrong, if the convergence took her instead of returning Thomas, she wanted everything settled. 2 days before the solstice, Webb made his move. Not with force, as Eleanor had expected, but with lawyers and official documents. A sheriff's deputy arrived at noon with a court order, signed by a federal judge, demanding the immediate seizure of the Guardian for national security purposes. Margaret's nephew was ready. He'd anticipated this strategy and had counter-motions prepared, emergency appeals filed with higher courts. The deputy, an older man named Harrison, who'd lived in the county his entire life, looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mrs. Hartwell, I don't know what's going on here," he said quietly. "And frankly, I'm not sure I want to know. But this order is legitimate. Federal jurisdiction, national security designation. I'm required to enforce it." "You're required to try," Margaret's nephew said, stepping forward. "But we have a stay from the state Supreme Court and appeals pending in 3 different jurisdictions. Touch that horse, and you'll be violating at least 4 separate legal orders." Harrison looked between them, clearly out of his depth. "This is above my pay grade. I'm going to make some calls." He left, promising to return with clarification. Eleanor watched him go, feeling the net closing around them. Webb was using the system, leveraging connections and classifications that had been maintained for 40 years. He'd kept Project Guardian alive somehow, kept the files active, waiting for this moment. "We need to be ready to move fast," Robert said after Harrison left. "If they come back with enough force, with federal marshals or military, we can't stop them legally." "Then we don't stop them legally," Eleanor said. "The solstice is in 2 days, 2 days. We just need to hold them off that long." That night they held a council in Eleanor's kitchen. 12 people crowded around the table, representatives from the Abenaki community, Betty and her husband, Sam, Margaret and her nephew Robert. They were an unlikely alliance, bound together by belief in something most of the world would dismiss as impossible. "The convergence will begin at midnight on the solstice," Robert explained, spreading his hand-drawn maps across the table. "The exact moment when the night is longest, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. It will build for approximately 1 hour, reach its peak, then gradually close again. During that window, the crossing will be fully open. And Thomas can cross back through," Eleanor asked. "Potentially, if the conditions are right, if his connection to the Guardian is strong enough. If nothing interferes." Robert looked at her seriously. "But Eleanor, there's something you need to understand. The crossing isn't just a doorway. It's a choice point. Thomas has been held in suspension because he's anchored to both sides. When the convergence opens fully, that suspension ends. He'll have to choose. Fully cross over into death, finding peace and release, or fully cross back into life, accepting whatever that means for his consciousness and physical form." "It's his choice," Eleanor said. "Not mine. No, it's both your choices. The crossing responds to connection, to relationship. Thomas can't cross back unless you accept him, unless you're willing to face what he's become, what 40 years in the between space has made him." Sam leaned forward. "What does that mean? What has it made him?" "I don't know," Robert admitted. "The stories talk about those who've crossed back, but they're vague. Changed, the legends say, touched by the other side. Some say they bring gifts, knowledge from beyond. Others say they bring burdens, awareness of things humans aren't meant to know." He looked at Eleanor. "You need to decide if you're willing to accept Thomas, regardless of what he's become. If you hesitate, if you doubt at the crucial moment, the crossing will reject him, and he'll be pulled back into the between space. Or worse. What's worse? Dissolution. Complete separation of consciousness from form. He would cease to exist in any state. Not alive, not dead, just gone. The room fell silent. Eleanor felt the weight of what Robert was describing. She'd spent 40 years mourning Thomas, learning to live without him. The prospect of his return was miraculous and terrifying in equal measure. But the idea that her uncertainty, her very human fear, could destroy him permanently was almost unbearable. "I won't hesitate," she said firmly. "Whatever Thomas has become, whatever the between space has made him, he's still my husband. I've waited 40 years. I can accept whatever comes through that crossing." Betty reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "We'll be with you, all of us. You won't face this alone." Plans were finalized. They would gather at the barn at 11 on solstice night. The Abenaki would perform protective ceremonies, creating a sacred space around the convergence point. Sam would be ready with medical equipment. Margaret and her nephew would maintain legal barriers for as long as possible. Betty's husband would coordinate security, watching for any sign of Webb's approach. "He'll come," Eleanor said with certainty. "Webb has waited too long, wants this too badly. He'll try to take the Guardian during the convergence, try to use the opening for his own purposes. Then we'll stop him," Robert said simply. "The crossings are sacred. They've been protected for thousands of years. One man's hunger for power won't change that." After everyone left, Eleanor went to the barn one final time. The Guardian stood in the moonlight, magnificent and mysterious. The dog tags around his neck glowed softly, and she could feel Thomas's presence stronger than ever, pressing close to the surface, preparing for what was coming. The day before, the solstice arrived cold and clear. Eleanor woke before dawn, her body thrumming with anticipation and fear. She went through her morning routine with mechanical precision, trying to maintain normalcy in a situation that had become anything but normal. Sam arrived early with news. "Webb's been making calls. I have a friend in the federal courthouse who says there's pressure coming from Washington. Old classified files being unsealed, national security protocols being activated. He's pulling every string he has. Will it work? Can he get here before the convergence? Margaret's nephew has bought us time. Maybe not much, but enough. The legal system moves slowly, even under pressure. We should be clear until tomorrow night." Should be. Eleanor heard the uncertainty in those words. Nothing was guaranteed. Webb had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, building connections, maintaining access. He would not be stopped easily. Robert arrived mid-morning with 4 elders from the Abenaki community. They carried items Eleanor didn't fully understand, sacred objects that had been protected for generations. They spent hours walking the property, marking boundaries, speaking in a language that predated English by thousands of years. Eleanor watched them work, feeling the weight of history pressing down. Her small farm, her simple life, had become the focal point of something ancient and significant. "The convergence will be powerful," one of the elders, a woman named Marie, told Eleanor. "We can feel it already building. The land remembers what's coming. The animals know. Look." Eleanor followed her gaze. Deer stood at the forest edge, dozens of them perfectly still and watching the barn. Birds had gathered in the trees, silent and attentive. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. "They're witnesses," Marie continued. "When the barrier opens, when the worlds touch, all living things feel it. Some are drawn to it, others flee, but none remain unchanged by the experience." Eleanor spent the afternoon with the Guardian, grooming him, speaking softly, preparing him as best she could. The horse was calm but intensely focused, his attention turned inward, as if listening to something only he could hear. She could feel Thomas more strongly now, his consciousness rising closer to the surface as the convergence approached. "Tomorrow night," she whispered, her forehead pressed against the Guardian's neck. "Tomorrow night we'll know. One way or another, this 40-year wait will end." As evening fell, Betty arrived with food, practical and thoughtful as always. "You need to eat. Keep your strength up. Tomorrow is going to be long and difficult." They sat at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal, not talking about what was coming because there was nothing left to say. All the preparations were made. All the choices had been locked in. Now there was only waiting. After Betty left, Eleanor took a long bath, washing away the day's tension. She laid out the blue dress she'd chosen, made sure Thomas's letter was in her pocket, checked that the house was in order. These small domestic acts grounded her, reminded her that whatever happened tomorrow, she was still Eleanor Hartwell, still herself, still rooted in this life she'd built. That night, she dreamed of Thomas for the last time before the convergence. But this dream was different from all the others. He wasn't distant or unreachable. He stood directly before her, solid and real, and when he spoke, she heard him clearly. "Ellie, tomorrow, whatever happens, whatever you see, remember that I love you. I've loved you from the first moment, and I'll love you until there's nothing left of me to love with. The Guardian has carried me this far. Your faith has sustained me. Now we just need courage, yours and mine together." She reached for him, and this time her hand didn't pass through empty air. She touched his face, felt the warmth of his skin, the familiar shape of his jaw. He was there, truly there, separated only by the thinnest of veils. "I'm not afraid," she told him. "Whatever you become, whatever comes through that crossing, I'm ready. I choose you, Thomas. I choose us. I choose this chance, no matter the cost." He smiled, the expression she'd carried in her heart for 40 years, and kissed her forehead. "Then tomorrow we begin again, or we end well. Either way, we'll be together for it." Eleanor woke with tears on her face and absolute certainty in her heart. The solstice was hours away. Webb would come with whatever force he could muster. The convergence would tear open the barrier between worlds, and she would stand in the center of it all, waiting for her husband to cross back from death itself. She rose, dressed in the blue dress, and walked to the barn where the Guardian waited. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The final day had begun. The winter solstice arrived with unusual stillness. No wind disturbed the snow-laden trees, no clouds marred the pale blue sky. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for nightfall and whatever the darkness would bring. Eleanor spent the day in quiet preparation. She moved through the house, touching objects that held meaning, saying silent goodbyes to a life that might change irrevocably after tonight. The coffee cup Thomas had bought, the grandfather clock that had marked their years together, photographs of moments that felt simultaneously close and impossibly distant. People began arriving at dusk. The Abenaki elders came first, carrying the ceremonial items they would need. Sam arrived with his medical equipment, his face drawn with concern, but his hands steady. Margaret and Betty came together, bringing thermoses of hot coffee and quiet support. By the time full darkness fell, 15 people had gathered, all committed to witnessing and protecting what was about to unfold. At 10 o'clock, they assembled in the barn. The Guardian stood at the center, the dog tags gleaming against his white coat. The symbols Robert had drawn around the property seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, though Eleanor couldn't tell if that was real or her imagination amplifying every detail. Robert and the elders began their ceremony. They spoke in the old language, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that felt older than time. They burned sage and sweetgrass, the smoke curling through the barn and out into the night. Marie placed stones at the 4 cardinal points, each one marked with symbols similar to those on Thomas's dog tags. Eleanor stood close to the Guardian, her hand resting on his neck. She could feel Thomas's presence stronger than ever, could sense his consciousness fully awake now, preparing for the crossing. The horse's heartbeat was steady beneath her palm, a counterpoint to her own racing pulse. At 11:30 the forest lights appeared, but these were different from the ones Eleanor had seen before. Brighter, more numerous, moving with purpose rather than drifting randomly. They emerged from the trees and advanced toward the barn, forming a circle around the property. Eleanor counted at least 30 distinct points of light, each pulsing in time, with some rhythm she could feel but not hear. "They're gathering," Robert said quietly. "The witnesses. When a crossing opens this fully, when something this significant happens, beings from both sides come to observe. They won't interfere, but they'll be present." At 11:45, the temperature dropped suddenly, 15 degrees in as many seconds. Everyone felt it, saw their breath turn to fog in air that had been merely cold before. The Guardian tensed, his muscles bunching beneath Eleanor's hand. She felt Thomas's consciousness surge, felt him preparing for what was coming. Then at 11:53, the first vehicle appeared at the end of the driveway. Headlights cut through the darkness, followed by a second set, then a third. Webb had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. Betty's husband, stationed at the observation post, radioed immediately. 3 vehicles, at least 6 people. They're armed. Sam moved to Eleanor's side. We can try to delay them, give you more time. No, Eleanor said. The convergence starts at midnight regardless. If Webb wants to be here, let him come. Let him see what happens when someone tries to force what should be freely given. The vehicles parked, and figures emerged. Webb led them, moving with the confident stride of someone who believed he'd already won. His team spread out, professional and efficient, clearly trained for exactly this kind of operation. They wore tactical gear and carried weapons that looked far too serious for what should have been a simple horse seizure. Webb stopped at the barn entrance, his eyes finding the Guardian immediately. Mrs. Hartwell, it's time to end this charade. That animal is government property, and I'm here under federal authority to reclaim him. He's not property, Eleanor said. And you know it. You've known it for 40 years. I know that he's the key to controlling phenomena that could change everything. Military applications, strategic advantages, the ability to access information from alternate timelines. And you're standing in the way of progress because of some sentimental attachment to a husband who died decades ago. Thomas didn't die. He sacrificed himself to stop people like you from weaponizing something sacred. And he's been waiting ever since for a chance to finish what he started. Webb laughed, but there was no humor in it. Waiting where? In heaven? In some mystical between-space? Mrs. Hartwell, you've been alone too long. You've convinced yourself of a fantasy. Then why are you here? Eleanor challenged. If it's all fantasy, if none of this is real, why have you spent 40 years searching? Why are you standing in my barn on the winter solstice with armed men? Webb's expression hardened. Because even if the metaphysics are nonsense, the Guardian himself is valuable. He's a biological anomaly, possibly the last of his kind. And at midnight, according to your friend's research, something is going to happen. A convergence. I intend to observe it, document it, and claim whatever results for the United States government. The barn clock began to chime. Midnight. The longest night of the year had reached its deepest point, and in the moment between one chime and the next, reality began to tear. The air split. There was no other way to describe it. Eleanor watched as a visible crack appeared in the space above the Guardian, a line of brilliant blue-green light that expanded outward like lightning frozen in time. The barn filled with a sound that wasn't quite sound, a vibration that bypassed ears and resonated directly in bone and blood. The Guardian reared, magnificent and terrifying, his white coat blazing with light that had no earthly source. The dog tags around his neck flared so bright that Eleanor had to shield her eyes. When she could see again, the crack had widened into a rift, and through it she could see the between space Thomas had described. It was neither dark nor light, neither empty nor full. Figures moved within it, shadowy and indistinct, people who existed in that state of suspension between life and death. And at the front, clear and solid and achingly familiar, stood Thomas. He looked exactly as he had 40 years ago. 35, strong, whole. He wore his desert uniform, and his eyes found Eleanor's across the impossible distance. She felt the impact of that gaze like a physical touch, felt 40 years of waiting compress into a single moment of recognition. Webb's team reacted with military precision, raising weapons, shouting orders. But Robert and the Abenaki elders stood firm, their ceremony intensifying, their voices rising to match the frequency of the convergence. The symbols on the ground blazed with the same light as the rift, creating a protective circle that Webb's people couldn't cross. "Stand down," Webb ordered his team, though his voice shook. He stared at the rift with an expression of hunger and fear mingled together. "Document everything. Record all readings. This is what we've been searching for." Eleanor ignored him. She moved toward the Guardian, toward the rift, toward Thomas. The air around the convergence point was thick, resistant, as if she were pushing through water. But she kept moving, drawn by a force stronger than fear. Thomas stepped forward on his side of the barrier. He reached out his hand, and Eleanor reached back. Their fingers almost touched, separated by the thinnest membrane of reality. She could feel his warmth, could see the individual lines of his palm, could hear his voice speaking her name. "Ellie, you came. You believed." "Always," she whispered. "I never stopped believing in you." The Guardian moved between them, his massive form somehow fitting into the space where worlds met. The dog tags around his neck began to separate, the chain dissolving into particles of light. The symbols rose from the metal, floating free, rearranging themselves into patterns Eleanor recognized from Robert's maps. A crossing chart, a bridge between dimensions. "Thomas has to choose," Robert's voice cut through the chaos. "And Eleanor, you have to accept his choice. Whatever he decides, you must let him go or welcome him back without hesitation. The crossing can't complete if there's doubt on either side." Eleanor looked at Thomas, really looked at him. She saw the man she'd married, yes, but she also saw what the between space had made him. His edges were slightly translucent, as if he existed in multiple states simultaneously. His eyes held knowledge that no living person should possess, understanding of realms beyond human comprehension. He was Thomas, but he was also something more, something changed by 4 decades in a place where time and space operated differently. "If you come back," she said clearly, "you won't be the same. The world has changed. I've changed. 40 years have passed and we can't get them back." "I know," Thomas said. "I've watched from the between. I've seen you live, seen you grieve, seen you grow strong in ways you never had to before. I'm not asking for the life we had. I'm asking for a chance at whatever life is possible now. And if you cross over completely, if you let go and find peace, then I'll carry you with me. Our love doesn't end just because the forms change." He smiled, that familiar expression that made her heart ache. "Either way, Ellie, we win. Either we get time together in this world, or we both finally find release. But I need you to choose with me. I need you to say yes to whatever comes through this crossing." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. The barn, the watching people, Webb and his weapons, all of it faded to insignificance. There was only this moment, this choice, this chance, that had been 40 years in the making. Webb moved suddenly, trying to force his way through the protective circle. "The horse belongs to the government. This convergence is federal property. I'm ordering all of you to stand down." The Guardian turned, and for the first time Eleanor saw rage in his expression. He reared again, his hooves striking the air, and a wave of energy rolled out from him. Webb's team was thrown backward, weapons clattering from their hands. Webb himself fell hard, his face showing real fear for the first time. "The crossing serve no government," Marie's voice rang out. "They serve love, sacrifice, and the sacred balance between worlds. You have no power here, Colonel Webb." The rift pulsed, growing larger. Time was running out. The convergence would reach its peak and then begin to close. If a choice wasn't made soon, if Thomas and Eleanor didn't commit, the opportunity would be lost. Eleanor placed both hands against the barrier, feeling it pulse beneath her palms. Thomas mirrored her movement, and where their hands met, the membrane began to thin. She could feel his skin now, warm and solid, more real with every passing second. "I choose you," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "I choose us. I choose whatever time we can have, whatever form you take when you cross back. I accept you, Thomas. Come home." Thomas's face transformed with relief and joy. "And I choose life. I choose you. I choose to return, whatever the cost, whatever I've become." "Ellie, I'm coming back." The Guardian threw his head back and made a sound unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard from a horse. It was a call, a cry, a song that resonated with the frequency of the convergence itself. The rift expanded suddenly, the barrier dissolving, where Thomas and Eleanor's hands pressed together, and Thomas stepped through. The moment his foot touched the barn floor, the world convulsed. Light exploded outward, blinding and beautiful. The Guardian's form began to change, becoming translucent, his physical body merging with something larger and more essential. The dog tags, now fully dissolved into pure light, spiraled around Thomas, wrapping him in symbols and energy. Thomas's body solidified with each passing second. The translucence faded, his edges became sharp and defined. He was crossing fully, bringing his consciousness from the between space back into physical form. Eleanor held onto his hands, anchoring him, giving him something real to hold onto as he made the transition. Webb scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with desperate hunger. He lunged toward the convergence, trying to reach the Guardian before the crossing completed. No, the horse is the key. I need him. I need access to the between. But Robert was there, and the Abenaki elders, forming a wall of human bodies between Webb and the sacred space. You were offered this gift 40 years ago, Robert said. Thomas showed you what sacrifice and love could accomplish. But you chose power instead. You chose control. The crossings will never open for you. Webb tried to push through, but Marie raised her hand, speaking words in the old language. The protective symbols flared, and Webb was thrown back again, this time with enough force that he stayed down. The Guardian's form was almost entirely light now, his physical shape barely visible within the brilliance. Eleanor understood what was happening. The Guardian had carried Thomas's consciousness for 40 years, had served as the bridge between worlds. Now, with Thomas crossing back, the Guardian's purpose was complete. He was releasing Thomas and returning to whatever realm the Guardians truly inhabited. Thomas was solid now, fully present, fully real. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, and she felt the living warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her chest. 40 years dissolved in that embrace, not forgotten, not erased, but suddenly made bearable by the reality of his return. The Guardian, now more spirit than flesh, moved toward the rift. He turned back once, his ancient eyes meeting Eleanor's. In that gaze, she saw understanding, completion, peace. He had fulfilled his promise. He had carried Thomas through 4 decades of waiting and delivered him safely home. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." The Guardian bowed his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. Then he turned and walked into the rift, his form dissolving completely as he crossed back into the between space. The light followed him, the symbols scattered, the rift began to close. Webb made one last desperate attempt, scrambling toward the shrinking opening. But it was too late. The convergence was ending, the barrier re-establishing itself. The rift sealed with a sound like a bell ringing, and the barn returned to ordinary darkness, lit only by lanterns and the stunned faces of witnesses. Thomas staggered, and Eleanor held him upright. He was breathing hard, his body adjusting to physical existence after decades as pure consciousness. Sam rushed forward with medical equipment, but Thomas waved him away. "I'm all right. Just need a moment. It's been a long time since I had a body." He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, seeing the 72 years she'd lived without him. His hand touched her silver hair, traced the lines on her face. "You're beautiful. You've always been beautiful. God, Ellie, I've missed you." Eleanor was crying, laughing, holding him so tight she was afraid she might hurt him. But he held her just as tight, and for the first moment in 40 years, she felt complete. Webb rose slowly, his face ashen. He looked at Thomas, at the closed rift, at the empty space where the Guardian had been. "It's gone. The Guardian is gone. The crossing is closed. 40 years and I've lost everything." "No," Thomas said, still holding Eleanor. "You chose to lose everything 40 years ago when you tried to weaponize something sacred. I'm just grateful the Guardian helped me choose differently." Webb and his team left without another word, defeated and empty-handed. They drove away into the winter night, and Eleanor knew they would not return. There was nothing left here for them to take. Dawn broke over Eleanor's farm with a gentleness that felt like blessing. The barn stood quiet now, the convergence complete, the rift sealed. In the place where the Guardian had vanished, a single white feather rested on the straw, impossibly soft, emanating a warmth that defied the winter cold. Eleanor picked it up carefully, feeling the last trace of the magnificent being who had carried her husband home. Thomas's dog tags lay beside it, returned and finally at peace. No warmth, no glowing symbols, just simple metal on a worn chain. Eleanor held them for a moment, then placed them in her pocket alongside the feather. Physical proof that the impossible night had been real. Sam had examined Thomas through the early morning hours, running tests that yielded results that made no medical sense. Thomas's body was 35 years old, healthy and whole, despite his consciousness having existed for 40 years in another state. Sam finally gave up trying to explain it scientifically and simply declared Thomas fit, a miracle wrapped in mysteries he would spend years trying to understand. The Abenaki elders prepared to leave as the sun climbed higher. Marie embraced Eleanor gently. The crossing is stable now, healed. Your husband's sacrifice 40 years ago and his choice last night have brought balance. The site will remain sacred, but it will not open again in our lifetimes. Thank you, Eleanor said, for protecting us, for believing. We were only continuing what our ancestors began. The crossings have always been protected, always will be. Robert lingered after the others left. He stood with Thomas in the barn, two men connected by events most of the world would never believe. You did something remarkable, Robert said quietly. Not many would have the strength to wait as you did, or the courage to choose as Eleanor did. I had no choice, Thomas replied. Love doesn't give you a choice. It just is. Betty and Margaret stopped by mid-morning, bringing food and practical comfort. They hugged Eleanor, welcomed Thomas with the easy acceptance of people who had witnessed miracles, and were determined to treat them as normal. Because what else could you do when the impossible became real? You made coffee, you shared breakfast, you moved forward. By afternoon, Eleanor and Thomas were alone. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor had listened to his tape, where she'd read his letter countless times, where she'd spent 40 years learning to live without him. Now he sat across from her, solid and present, and the world had to be reimagined around this new reality. I remember it all, Thomas said. Every day you lived. I wasn't fully conscious in the between, but I was aware. I saw you grieve, saw you heal, saw you build a life. You were so strong, Ellie. I had to be. You weren't here to be strong for me. I'm here now. He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, alive, real. I don't know what happens next. I'm 35 in a world 40 years older than when I left. You're 72, and I'm asking you to start over with a man who looks like your memory, but has been changed by things he can barely explain. Eleanor smiled, feeling peace settle into her bones. We figure it out, day by day. That's all anyone can do. They spent the evening walking the property, Thomas relearning the land he'd loved, seeing what had changed and what remained constant. The barn where he'd hidden his final message. The greenhouse he'd built with his own hands. The bedroom they'd shared, now occupied by a woman who'd aged while he'd remained suspended. As night fell, they stood together in the barn doorway watching the forest. No lights appeared. The guardian was gone, his mission complete. But Eleanor could feel his presence in the warmth of the feather she kept in her pocket, in the peace that had settled over the land. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the living warmth of his body. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of grief, transformed into this moment of quiet completion. We did it, she said softly. You came back. You never let me go, Thomas replied. That made all the difference. They stood there as darkness deepened, two people who had loved each other across the impossible distance between worlds, who had chosen each other despite time and death and the barriers between realities. The farm settled into night around them. The chickens roosted, the trees whispered in a gentle wind, and somewhere in the distance a single white feather glowed softly in the darkness. A reminder that some promises transcend everything, even death itself.